All right, let's see if we can get started. Oh, perfect. I have issues with technology at Signal. They gave us these new internet phones and the internet phones. Maybe everybody else's works, mine certainly doesn't. So if you try to call me, it's going to be a lost cause. You're not going to get through to me. All right, where the hell are we? Courses, urban adaptations. There we go. Let's see. The graphs that you guys made, I've graded those. There's one more that just came in. I'll take care of that. Let's see, Caleb. Some of you were pretty creative, and I appreciate that. Mason. Tyler. But none of the graphs really get across the idea that we're trying to get across. Samantha, you came closest. So, Emma, and then Jacob Thompson. Ready. Okay, so what I will do sometime over the next day or two, as soon as I get caught up with life and whatnot, I will get those. I'll show you how I would do it. In lab, what we will do is we'll try and get finished up with the morphometric stuff in the jaws, and I will show you how to get all of those mechanical advantage things and whatnot computed. And then we're going to take that and we're going to put it back into Morpho-J, and then we'll do our computations. Okay? So that's what we will do on Thursday. What I want to do today is I want to talk about, we jumped a little bit ahead by talking about locomotion, but I wanted to get that stuff in before we have to shut down because of COVID. I don't know if you guys are keeping track of the number of COVID cases in Cape, or in Cape it's skyrocketing. At the university, it's going up quite dramatically as well. There were 11 new cases posted yesterday. So we're up now to 71 cases. The rate of increase is still significantly exponential, but it's not increasing as rapidly as I thought it would. But it is still increasing faster and faster, which is a worrisome sign. You guys aren't any different from any other college students, so it's not anything necessarily that you're doing. Well, it is what you're doing, but it is the nature of being a young adult, I guess. All right, let's go back a little bit, talk about vertebrate origins, and then perhaps all this business about locomotion and regionalization of the vertebral column, and the sort of stuff that we've been talking about with bone morphology will register a little more. So we want to talk about vertebrate origins. And I guess what we have to do is we have to go all the way back to general zoology with Tim Judd and think about what vertebrates are. And when Tim Judd does his, I don't know if he does this march through the phyla, which is sort of standard operating procedure, you look at all the, the cnidarians and the peripherans and all these different groups, and you end up with, his big deal is going to be arthropods and whatnot. And then the last 5 minutes of the last day of class or something, he'll just talk about chordates, which is everybody else. And he's being honest and fair, giving this group the coverage that it deserves. If you think about it in terms of numbers of species or something, the chordates are a pretty minor group. Vertebrates aren't really very important in terms of overall species diversity. On the other hand, they're big, right? And they're big for a reason. And the impact that they have is quite significant. So we need to understand who the vertebrates are, and we can't understand who the vertebrates are unless we understand who the chordates are. So, who are the chordates? Well, the chordates are these weird little animals that have a couple of key characteristics that are different from what you see in all of the other animals, all the arthropods and the annelids and the platyhelminths and all those guys. First of all, they have a notochord at some stage in life. Okay? What is a notochord? It's simply a cartilaginous rod that runs the length of the body. Okay? No other animals do that except chordates. Okay? The chordates include the vertebrates, so the vertebrates are a subgroup within the chordates. Within the chordates, everybody has a notochord, this cartilaginous rod that runs the length of the body. They also have a hollow nerve cord that runs the length of the body, and it's dorsal. In arthropods, it's ventral. Okay? But in chordates, it's dorsal. So they have a notochord, they have this dorsal hollow nerve cord. In other words, there's a lumen running down the center of that cord, which is going to be filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Okay? They also have pharyngeal gill slits. So you have a notochord. You still do, although it's been completely surrounded by bone. You have a dorsal hollow nerve cord that's called your spinal cord. And you have pharyngeal gill slits too, at least in the fetal stages. Okay? But evidence of those gill slits are still there in terms of the cartilaginous rods that supported them. They are still part of your skeleton. They are still there now. Okay? And there's this thing called an endostyle, which sits on the floor of the mouth, and in vertebrates, it becomes the thyroid gland. But in chordates, it's involved in processing food and digestion and things of that sort of stuff. Okay, things of that sort. They also have a muscular post-anal tail. So the tail comes behind the anus, and it's muscular, which means they can move it. Okay? They have a ventral heart with a closed circulatory system, and they have a living bony or cartilaginous endoskeleton. Well, if you think about it, arthropods, crustaceans, they all have an exoskeleton. We're different. Our skeleton is on the inside. That's important because it changes the biomechanics and it changes how you grow. If you have an internal skeleton, you can become much larger. If you have an external skeleton, you're going to be size limited. And that's all because of surface area to volume and those sorts of things, and just the mechanics of materials, the mechanical properties of those materials. Imagine what happens in the life of an insect when it wants to get bigger. It has to shed its exoskeleton and then develop a new one. That means for a short period of time at least, it's totally vulnerable. It can't move. It's stuck. So any predator that comes along can feed on it. That doesn't happen with us. Okay? All right. So those are the, one important one. Let's spend just a moment talking about the business of the ventral heart with a closed circulatory system. Insects, arthropods, crustaceans, all those other groups of organisms, annelids, platyhelminths, they all have an open circulatory system. And the heart, instead of being ventral, is dorsal. You can think of the heart as like an oil pump in your car. You can think of the circulatory system in an arthropod like the oil system in your car. You know that you have to put oil in the engine, and if you don't, it's going to lock up, it's going to freeze up, and you've ruined the engine. Okay? So how does that work? At the bottom of the engine is this oil pan filled with oil. There's a pump which is pumping that oil up to the top of the engine and spraying it across the top of the engine. Then there are all these little tiny holes that allow the oil to run down, and the oil then runs down across the bearings, down all these little channels, and drains back into the oil pump, where it gets pumped back up to the top, and then just drips down over everything. So that is an open system. Of course, the problem with that system is if you take your car and turn it upside down and then turn on the engine, it'll run just fine for a while, but ultimately there's no oil that's going to be pumping around all the bearings, and it'll seize up. So the engine in your vehicle has to be right side up. It will not last very long upside down. Okay? The same is true with your motorcycle or your ATV or whatever it is that you're using. Okay? In a vertebrate, the system is closed. There is no open sump. Okay? So the blood stays, for the most part, inside the circulatory system all the time. So you can be upside down, whatever you want. It's not going to change anything. That's a fundamental difference. There are a couple of other interesting little phenomena. What do we use to carry oxygen? What metal do we use to carry oxygen in our blood? Iron, right? So we use iron, and how do you know? Because what color is your blood? It's red. So when your blood is oxygenated, that iron is oxidized and it turns red. The color of rust. Okay? In an insect, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, what metal do they use?
Is it cold?
Copper. So it's green. Okay? Imagine if we were derived from the insects. Wouldn't that be awesome? And our blood would be green. How cool would that be, huh? All right. There are a couple of things here to think about. First of all, the ventral heart. Second, or the ventral heart with a closed circulatory system, that's important. And the living endoskeleton. That's another critical, but those two things alone make it possible for us to be big. And we are huge compared to the invertebrates. Okay? You don't find any spiders as big as us. You don't find any grasshoppers or cockroaches as big as us. They can't because of those two limitations. They have an exoskeleton and they have an open circulatory system, and that puts significant limits on how big they can be. More about that in a little bit. So let's look at a couple of chordate groups. The first group are the urochordates, and I'm just going to go over these very briefly. These are the sea squirts, the tunicates. I don't know if you guys have ever lived out west or on the ocean, maybe along the east coast or something. When I was a high school kid, spent a lot of time in the water, spent a lot of time at the beach and things of that sort. And one of the jobs that you could get